Hey guys, welcome to episode 8 of Custom Card Reviews. Just a friendly reminder that submissions are currently closed unless you are on the CCG family tier in Patreon or YouTube memberships. But if you are still looking for a custom card community and really just all things Yu-Gi-Oh!, you can check out the Discord there with a link in the description. Now, let's jump in. This submission is by Wightsworn. It is a custom archetype called the Eclair Knight. Per the submission, it is a rank 4 spam / OTK archetype designed to make your opponent attack and take damage on their own turn. So let's have a look. Starting off with Eagle of the Eclair Knight. So when this card is normal special summon, you can add one Eclair Knight card from your deck to your hand except Eagle. You can only use this effect of Eagle of the Eclair Knights once per turn. You can add special summon monsters in attack position the turn you activate this effect. An exceeds monster that has this card as a material gains the following effect: change all monsters your opponent controls to attack position. Moving into Lancer of the Eclair Knights. If this card is normal summon, you can special summon one Eclair Knight monster from your deck in defense position. You cannot special summon monsters in attack position the turn you activate this effect. An exceeds monster that has this card as a material gains the following effect: Eclair Knight monsters you control gain defense equal to this monster's original defense. So that would give the exceeds monster 2100 extra defense. Moving into Priestess of the Eclair Knights, you can discard one card, special summon this card from your hand in defense. Then you can special summon one Eclair Knight monster from your grave in defense. You can only use this effect of Priestess of the Eclair Knights once per turn. You cannot special summon monsters in attack the turn you activate this effect. An exceeds monster that has this card as a material gains the following effect: Eclair Knight monsters you control are unaffected by your opponent's activated effects that do not activate on the field. And now we have Saint of the Eclair Knights. If you control an Eclair Knight monster, you can special summon this card from your hand in defense position. Then you can banish one card on the field. You can only use this effect of the Saint once per turn. You cannot special summon monsters in attack the turn you activate this effect. An exceeds monster that has this card as a material gains the following effects: monsters you control can attack while in face-up defense position. If they do, apply their defense for damage calculation. Now we get into the exceeds monsters, starting with Hallowed Saint of the Eclair Knights. The materials are 2 or more level 4 monsters. Cannot be used as material for an exceed summon except for the exceed summon of an Eclair Knight monster. Once per turn, you can destroy cards your opponent controls up to the number of Eclair Knight monsters this card has as material. An exceeds monster that has this card as material gains the following effect: attack position monsters your opponent controls have their effects negated the turn they are special summoned. Now we get into Wilbert, Captain of the Eclair Knights. Materials are 2 level 4 monsters. When this card is exceeds summoned using an Eclair Knight monster as material, you can send one Eclair Knight card from your deck to your grave. You can only use this effect of Wilbert, Captain of the Eclair Knights once per turn. Monsters your opponent control must attack if able. At the start of the damage step, if an Eclair Knight monster you control is attacked, inflict 2000 damage to your opponent. And then finally, of the monsters, we have Wilbert, Despair of the Eclair Knights. The materials are 2 level 8 monsters. You can also exceed summon this card using rank 4 exceeds monster with 2 or more Eclair Knight monsters attached to it as material. Transfer its materials to this card. Monsters your opponent controls must attack if able. Also, they must target this card for attacks if able. Eclair Knight monsters you control gain defense equal to the total defense of this card's material. Your opponent cannot activate cards or effects during the battle phase. And now moving into the spell of the batch, we have Eclair Knight's Command. This allows you to add one Eclair Knight spell trap card from your deck to your hand, except another copy of the command. If an Eclair Knight exceeds monster as special summon, you can set this card from your grave but return it to the bottom of the deck when it leaves the field. You can only use this effect of Eclair Knight's command once per turn. You can only activate one command per turn. Next, we have Eclair Knight's Counterattack. This is a quick play spell. If you control an Eclair Knight monster, target one face-up card on the field, negate that target's effects until the end of the turn. Also, if that target was a monster, change its attack to 0 until the end of this turn, and if you do, all Eclair Knight monsters you control gain defense equal to that target's original attack until the end of this turn. And then we have Zeno, Paradoxical Shield of your Eclair Knights. Continuous spell. If this card is activated, add one Eclair Knight monster from deck to hand. Eclair Knight monsters you control are unaffected by your opponent's activated effects during their turn, unless those effects target those monsters. Any battle damage inflicted to your opponent during the battle phase is doubled. You can only activate one Zeno per turn. Alright, so let's move back up to the top. So the general effect that's shared among the 4 main deck monsters is that when you activate their effects, you can't special summon monsters in attack. And so the submission mentioned that that's a way of locking the deck out of link summoning, which this is true, but I would still say that that restriction for certain effects particularly needs to be a bit stronger, because even if you can't summon an attack, that still certainly allows you to go into a plethora of exceeds plays, which is still very much a thing, not just for the archetype, but just for Yu-Gi-Oh! In general. And so when you have powerful effects, just because you lock the to lock yourself out of link summoning doesn't mean that the lock is sufficient, that the restriction is sufficient for given the power level of the effect. And I'll point those out as we go through the cards. But Eagle in particular, so this is your typical solid starter, feeds into the gimmick of the deck with the restriction on yourself, and then when it's a material, it forces your opponent into attack position. So the mission of the deck is to get your opponent to attack, and so part of that is forcing your opponent's monsters into attack mode, and then we saw that one of the other cards forces your opponent to attack if able, and so this makes them able by putting them in attack. So this is a great card for the deck. The Lancer, so yeah, this is what I was going on about, and I'll say this till I'm blue in the face on as many submissions that come with an effect like this. It's not, at least in my opinion, good design to have special summons from the deck without having a legitimate trade-off. So your trade-off, again, you can't link summon, but that still leaves you with plenty of rank 4 plays, which of course is, as people say, the best Xyz plays out there, and not just for your archetype, but just in general for the number of rank 4s that exist. So for example, this and it goes beyond just being able to go into rank 4s, because this allows you to go into Eagle, which then gets you a search. So your one summon here gets you another body on board, which then gets you another search. So in my opinion, this needs to have a bit more of a restriction. You either need to negate the effect of the monster that you're summoning, or you need to have a far more stringent restriction on here as opposed to just blocking you out of special summoning in attack mode. As far as the gain effect goes, I think this is good. The Eclair Knight monster gains defense equal to 2100, so that's solid for the deck, not only so that your opponent attacks into a high defense monster, but as we saw, you also have a way to attack with your defense mode monster, so that's all well and good. The Priestess, so this card is in a bit of a weird spot, because typically you can't activate effects that would let you summon from the grave if you don't have a valid target at activation, but you worded this as an optional, so I don't think that rule applies. So you could theoretically have nothing in your grave, pitch an Eclair Knight monster to summon this, then bring back the Eclair Knight. My first thought was that this effectively becomes summoning 2 Eclair Knight monsters from your hand, but as I thought about it, I figured that it's a cost to discard, and so if it gets blocked, then you're putting yourself in a hole, and so I think the trade-off there is ultimately fine. It's the other effect is, it's an interesting protection effect. So usually you see basic stuff like can't be targeted, can't be destroyed, or what have you. So this specifically makes them unaffected by card effects that do not activate on the field. So it's a very unique take on a protection effect, and I like that. Moving into the Saint, so another thing that I'll say till I'm blue in the face, non-targeting, non-destruction removal needs to require investment. So this is a incredibly easy to bring out monster. You just need to have any one of your other Eclair Knight monsters on board, and you can bring it out and then banish any one card on the field. Yeah, no, that's way too powerful for my taste. So I would require it to, maybe it's just, it negates the effect of a card on the field, it destroys a spell and trap, it destroys a monster, something along those lines, something more specific than just banishing any one card on the field. As far as the gain effect goes, so kind of in line with the rest of the gain effects, I think you're doing well here on those effects, where in this case you can attack with your defense position monster. So this gives the deck more options, as opposed to just forcing your opponent into attacking your own defense guys. You can attack with your defense guys. So that's a good addition to the deck. Moving into the Hallowed Saint, so this is a pretty powerful effect. I would at least require a detach, whether that be before or after the destruction effect part, or maybe it just activates on summon. I just think having that as a repeated ability is a little too much. I also find it odd that this monster doesn't have any detach effects, and I don't think any of them did actually. Which there's probably a handful out there that don't. So it's just interesting to see that the whole archetype is operating that way. But I think you have an opportunity here, and I know the attachments are necessary because they provide those added effects. But then I would just water that first effect down a bit so that it only activates on summon. The stun effect here is, I think it's good. I like how you piecemeal your ideal game state with different effects that, like, you have this attached, and you have that attached, and you have this attached, and you have this spell, and you have that spell, and you have this monster on board, and that's where you get to your ideal game state and have all those effects working in tandem. So I like the design aspect in that regard. Moving into the Wilbert. So the Wilbert, everything here is solid except for that last effect. I think 2000 burn is just too much on a card if it doesn't also require burning yourself. even if it is a niche effect. I would lower that to 1,000. Maybe you could get away with 1,500, but at that point, I would say it needs a required detach. So similar feedback to the previous card. I know those attached materials are critical to gain those effects, so I'm not as adamant about forcing it to detach here, but I would at least lower that 2,000 down to 1,500 or ideally 1,000. And you're already, in your ideal world, you're already getting a lot of battle damage here inflicted anyways. Like if you have 2,500 defense here, you gain the 2,100 with the other card, so you're already at 4,600. So you're probably already going to be inflicting a fair amount of battle damage anyways. All right, moving into the ranked 8. So the defense gain effect combos well in those two ways that I was talking about, where either you attack with your defense value or you force your opponent to attack into your big defense monsters. Just doing calculations in my head, I think like the average defense of these monsters, not including this guy, is like in the low 2,000s, like maybe 2,200-ish. So all of your monsters would be gaining 6,600-ish defense, assuming this guy has only 3 materials, and then more if you have more materials. That can be a bit crazy since it applies to all of your Eclair Knights. I would consider maybe just applying it to only this guy. But if you want the mass boost, then maybe it's like all your Eclair Knights gain defense equal to the number of materials on this card times 1,000, something like that. At the end of the day, it's a big beat stick, and it doesn't have any built-in protections. It has the one afforded by Priestess if it's a material, but it's not like a huge insurmountable boss, right? So, but even if not, I like to assess things more on design principle and not just meta relevance. And I think a mass bare minimum 6,000 defense boost to all of your monsters is just a slightly questionable principle in my opinion. The lock effect. So the lock during the battle phase is an effect that few cards have, but it's generally an effect you have to really work for. Like this card is pretty easy to bring out. It just takes one Lancer going off, or then you can bring out a body from your deck, go into your rank 4, and then stack this guy on top of it, right? So it's pretty easy to bring out. Again, not a point about meta relevance because so much depends on the main phase nowadays, and the battle phase is often just kind of like a formality, but more so design principle that powerful effects and floodgate effects, at least in my opinion, should require some effort to achieve. I wouldn't fault you for leaving this as is because, again, I don't think you're breaking anything here by having this effect on a card with little protections. But if you wanted the utmost balance, then you could have it such that the effect only applies while it has material, and then force the card to detach at the end of any battle phase where it battles. Something like that to make it at least a bit more balanced in terms of more, again, balance in terms of principle more as opposed to balance in terms of meta relevance. Moving into the spells. So pretty powerful search card here. I see the basic combo where you have the rank 4 Wilbert, send it to the grave, then when you stack the rank 8 on top of it, you get it back, and then you can get a search. So it's certainly nifty. I don't hate it. I think you can probably leave it as is. So yeah, I think it's maybe fine. The counterattack. So it's a good disruption, plays into the deck's core strategy. You are a bit hesitant just because it basically turns any Eclair Knight you summon into an Omni Negator. But again, since it's not something I totally hate, so I think this could be fine as well. The Zeno. So here's your protection card where it'll keep your bosses safe from non-targeting effects. Much needed since you otherwise don't have protection in the deck aside from the Priestess. And I also like that you specified that it's on your opponent's turn, so it still leaves them an opening on your turn. So that's good design balancing there. The doubling battle damage is pretty nasty. I think if you edit the 2,000 burn on Captain, this is probably fine. I know you're going for an OTK. The 2,000 burn in general design practice is too much, but this here is probably, I think, fine. One thing I will say though is that for the sake of avoiding this card being abused in some unforeseen fashion, maybe require those battles to involve an Eclair Knight monster, or at least require you to control an Eclair Knight monster to make that effect active. Just so that other decks can't possibly abuse it. So that's just one thing to consider there. So moving on to the grading, the design I give an 8. I think you've got good variety here. I like that the deck has 2 ways to pull off the massive damage, both through attacking with defense and then forcing your opponent to attack. And the cards here flow pretty well with each other, so it's a good, well-designed archetype. The creativity I give a 6. The attack with defense isn't a novel concept like we have Super Heavy Samurai, but I do think the deck still separates itself, if by nothing else, in the fact that it's an Xyz-based archetype. I know you mentioned that the art comes from Shadowverse, but I'm not familiar with that, and if there is any lore on which the effects are based on, I don't have the knowledge of it, so I can't really give you bonus points. So I'll leave the creativity at a 6. And then the balance, I'll give a 6 as well. I think you do some things well, but some of the things I pointed out that, again, not necessarily based on if it's meta defining, but just more about whether it's good design principle, and maybe that's just the nature of trying to fit in everything within a 10 card limit. But yeah, just some things to clean up on some cards, and I think this would be a really well thought out archetype. So that gives the overall score with 866, an average of 6.7. Thank you, Wightsworn, for your submission. This submission is by Mardras. It is support for an existing archetype called the Mekk-Knights. The Mekk-Knight's gimmick is playing off the placement of cards in columns to get them to special summon themselves, and then other column-based effects. Like, for example, they have a way of locking your opponent out of monster, spell, and trap effects if they activate in the same column as your Mekk-Knight monster. So let's see what we've got. We've got 4 cards, starting with the one main deck inclusion that is Mekk-Knight White Sunrise. You can special summon this card from your hand by sending 1 level 5 or higher Mekk-Knight monster from your deck to the grave. Also, you cannot summon for the rest of the turn except Mekk-Knight monsters. You can only special summon Mekk-Knight White Sunrise once per turn this way. If this card is normal or special summon, you can set 1 World Legacy continuous spell trap from your deck or graveyard, and if it is a trap, it can be activated this turn. You can only use this effect of Mekk-Knight White Sunrise once per turn. Next up, we have a Synchro Mekk-Knight Neon Reflection. This is a level 4. But it doesn't have materials. Instead, it can't be synchro summoned. So that's a condition that applies to a handful of synchro monsters out there. So nothing out of the ordinary there. Must be special summoned from your extra deck by shuffling 7 Mekk-Knight monsters with different names from your banishment into the deck or extra deck. You can only use each of the following effects of Mekk-Knight Neon Reflection once per turn. Quick effect, you can return 1 spell trap on the field to the hand, inflict 2,000 damage to your opponent, and gain 2,000 life points. If this card is in your grave, you can return it to the extra deck, special summon 1 Mekk-Knight Avram from your hand, deck, or grave. Now we get into an Xyz Orcust Mekk-Knight Black Comet. This is a rank 4 that takes 2 Orcust and or Mekk-Knight monsters. You can detach 2 materials from this card and return 1 spell trap on the field to the hand. Banish all cards in your opponent's grave face down. Then you can negate the effects of 1 face-up card on the field until the end of this turn. If this card is in your grave, you can return it to the extra deck, special summon 1 Girsu the Orcust Mekk-Knight from your hand, deck, or grave. You can only use each effect of Orcust Mekk-Knight Black Comet once per turn. And then finally, we have Mekk-Knight Rainbow Iris. The materials are 1 non-link Mekk-Knight monster. Quick effect, you can send 1 Mekk-Knight effect monster from your deck to the grave, and if you do, replace this card's name, original attack, and this effect with that monster's until the end phase. If this card is destroyed or banished, you can target 1 Mekk-Knight monster in your grave added to your hand. You can only use each effect of Mekk-Knight Rainbow Iris once per turn. Alright, so let's go back up to the top, starting with the White Sunrise. The White Sunrise, so this first thing I would say here is that this first effect, I would think, reads more like an activated effect. Like I'm having trouble thinking off the top of my head any summoning condition that sends cards from your deck to the grave. So my personal opinion, I think it should just read as a activated summoning effect. So you could have it send 1 level 5 or higher Mekk-Knight monster from deck to the grave, and then if you wanted it as a cost, you would put semicolon and then special summon this card from your hand. Or if you want it as part of the effect, you would say send 1 level 5 or higher Mekk-Knight monster from deck to grave, and if you do, you can special summon this card from your hand. So that's just one small thing there. As far as the card itself goes, as the effect goes, it's a faster Keyblade Master. The Keyblade Master is a link 2 that grabs you any World Legacy spell trap. This one specifically grabs you only the continuous ones, which are still leaves you some good options, but the better thing about this card is that it gives the deck another decent going first option. So this deck relies often on your opponent having cards in their own zones, and so it's kind of a go second type of deck. So this gives the deck a nice go first move, and I think that helps resolve one of the more prominent weaknesses of the deck. Moving on into the Synchro, the Neon Reflection. So just another PSCT thing. So you have here a quick effect, : you can return 1 spell trap on the field to the hand, : So card effects don't ever have 2 colons, right? You either meant a semicolon here, or you need to change this into one whole effect, where it's like you can return 1 spell trap on the field to the hand, then inflict 2,000 damage to your opponent and gain 2,000 life points. So either one of those would do. The other thing about this, so I'm not too sure about this being a quick effect, since you're basically able to deal 2,000 damage on your turn and then your opponent's turn. So yeah, theoretically, if this guy lasts on the field for 4 turns, then you've won the game just by using his effect. I think 2,000 damage on any burn effect is pretty hefty. Like there should be some sort of, like it should burn you too, or it shouldn't be so easy to activate. I know this guy is pretty hard to bring out. I don't know how quickly you can get 7 Mekk-Knight monsters with different names into your banishment, but nonetheless, I still think the burn is too much. So I would either recommend not making this a quick effect, so make it an ignition effect, or lower that burn to 1,000. And if you do that, maybe you can make the summoning requirement less stringent. You don't have to make it 7 that way. Moving on to the Xyz. So the Xyz, yeah, I combed through all the Xyz that currently exist and did not find one that doesn't require the materials to have the same level or the same rank. And then some Xyz monsters have the conditional summoning ability where you can overlay it on top of an existing Xyz monster. But beyond that, yeah, there isn't one that exists where it's just any 2 monsters. So correct me if I'm wrong, but at least that's based on what I found. And so I get that Mekk-Knights are kind of all over the place with their levels. But then the question is, why is this an Xyz monster and not like a Link or a Contact Fusion? And if it were a Contact Fusion, you could have a Contact Fuse by banishing the monsters so that you can have more fodder for the Synchro. Or you could even send them to the grave, and there's ways probably that the deck can take advantage of the ones in your graveyard. So that's just my thought on that. I don't think this needs to be an Xyz monster. As for the effect, I would be careful on the mass banish face down, even if it is just the graveyard. Even that is very sparse. Like you don't have too many cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! That mass banish from the grave face down, and specifically for the opponent's cards. So maybe consider changing it to banishing 1 monster from the grave face down, or if you insist on the mass banish, then definitely don't make it a face down banish. I just think that's too much, because then on top of that, you have another effect attached to it, which is probably the main part of the effect, that you negate the effects of 1 face-up card on the field until the end of the turn. But even this part of it, banishing all cards in your opponent's graveyard face down, is really powerful. So I would be careful about that, especially since this is a pretty easy to bring out monster. Like unlike the last one, the Synchro, this one, getting out 2 of your archetype monsters is pretty easy to do. So banishing all cards in your opponent's graveyard face down, I think it's too powerful an effect on an easy to bring out monster. And then the Link. So here's the thing about this card. A Link 1 does a lot for really any deck. It just gives it that extra extension play. Like say you have your opening play is to summon something that gets you a search and your opponent blocks that. Well, now you can go into your Link 1, right? So that's the general idea behind Link 1. The thing about this card though, and this deck in particular, is that a Link 1 does a lot for the deck just by virtue of being a Link 1. So it gets you an extra card in a column, that being your extra monster zone column. The columns that have those zones in it. It gets you a Mekk-Knight monster in the grave, so that combos well with other effects that require Mekk-Knight monsters being in the grave. It combos easy with other cards in the deck, and then you add on top of that what the actual effect does, which is loading up the grave very quickly, while also basically turning any one of your Mekk-Knight monsters into any other Mekk-Knight monster. All that said, I think given that the amount of stuff that that this card does for the deck, I would make this a Link 2. But I understand that the benefit of there being a Link 1 is to give the deck an extra extension in case the first move or 2 is blocked. So if it is going to remain a Link 1, then I would modify the effect to not make it so powerful. I think effects like this tend to be reserved for more powerful, harder to bring out cards than Link 1. So that's just my thought on the matter. Moving on to the grading. The design, I give an 8. So this answers a lot of the issues with the archetype, particularly that it doesn't have, as it stands, the best going first option. So this certainly, between the Link monster and the main deck monster, gives you more options to work with. The creativity, I give a 5. Like I've mentioned with other support-based submissions, creativity is naturally confined to the design aspects dictated by the existing archetype. So I don't feel strongly one way or the other about the creative liberties taken here, and that's not an indictment. It's not a praise either. It's just kind of the nature of creating support for an already existing archetype. And then for balance, I give a 6. I think some of the effects just need a little fine tuning, but they all have a good design foundation. So I'll leave that at a 6. And that gives the overall grade a 6.3. Thank you, Mardras, for your submission. This submission is by Rosa. It is the Peggle archetype, but is based on a children's pachinko game. The deck is based using Pendulum and Link monsters, so let's have a look. Starting with Peggle Ball. You can place this card in the spell and trap zone as a continuous trap. Add 1 Peggle card from your deck to your hand, then draw 1 card. While this card is a continuous trap, you can target one pendulum monster in your pendulum zone or one pendulum monster card treated as a continuous trap on the field. Special summon it and this card to your field. You can't special summon level 1 monsters the turn you use this effect except Peggle Ball. You can only use each effect of Peggle Ball once per turn. Next up is Peggle Master Bajorn. The pendulum effect is when this card is placed in the pendulum zone, you can discard one card in your hand, send one Peggle monster from your deck to the grave, then place this card in your spell and trap zone as a continuous trap. You can only use this effect of Peggle Master Bajorn once per turn. Monster effect, you can reveal this card in your hand, place this card in the spell and trap zone as a continuous trap, then draw one card. While this card is a continuous trap, you can reveal one Peggle Pendulum monster in your hand. Special summon it. You can't special summon level 5 monsters the turn you use this effect, except the Bajorn. You can only use each effect of the Bajorn once per turn. Next up is the Peggle Master Claude. Pendulum effect, when this card is placed in the pendulum zone, you can discard one card in your hand, draw 2 cards, then place this card in your spell and trap zone as a continuous trap. You can only use this effect of Claude once per turn. Monster effect, you can discard one card, add one Peggle spell from your deck to your hand, then draw one card. While this card is a continuous trap, you can reveal one Peggle Pendulum monster in your hand, special summon this card. You can't special summon level 4 monsters the turn you use this effect except Claude. You can only use each effect of Claude once per turn. Next up is the Peggle Master Renfield. Pendulum effect, when this card is placed in your pendulum zone, you can discard one card in your hand, send one Peggle monster from your hand and this card to your spell and trap zone as continuous traps. So place one Peggle monster from your hand and this card in your spell and trap zone as continuous traps. You can only use this effect of Peggle Master Renfield once per turn. Monster effect, you can reveal this card in your hand, special summon a monster treated as a continuous trap. While this card is a continuous trap, you can add one Peggle monster in your grave to your hand, then draw one card. You can't special summon level 3 monsters the turn you use this effect except Peggle Master Renfield. You can only use each effect of Peggle Master Renfield once per turn. Now we have Peggle Master Cat-Tut. Pendulum effect, when this card is placed in the pendulum zone, you can discard one card in your hand, add one Peggle monster from your deck to your hand, then place this card in your spell and trap zone as a continuous trap. You can only use this effect of the Cat-Tut once per turn. Monster effect, you can reveal this card in your hand, set one Peggle trap from your deck or grave to your field. While this card is a continuous trap, quick effect, you can reveal one Peggle Pendulum monster in your hand, special summon it, and this card. Then immediately after this effect resolves, link summon using monsters on your field as materials. You can't special summon level 6 monsters the turn you use this effect except Cat-Tut. You can only use each effect of the Cat-Tut once per turn. Alright, moving into the links. Peggle Master Splork. Materials are 2 light monsters, including at least one Peggle monster. If this card was link summoned using only Peggle monsters, you can place one monster used for this monster's link summon face up in your spell and trap zone as a continuous trap. You can also place this card in your spell and trap zone as a continuous trap. You can only use the effect of Peggle Master Splork once per turn. And then we have the boss, Peggle Master Lord Cinderbottom. The materials are 2 or more light monsters, including at least one Peggle monster. While this card points to a monster, quick effect, you can place that card in your spell and trap zone as a continuous trap. During either player's turn while this card is on the field, quick effect, you can send one continuous trap on the field to its owner's hand. So return one continuous trap on the field to its owner's hand, shuffle one card on the field into the deck, then both players draw one card. You can only summon Peggle Master Lord Cinderbottom once per turn. And then we get into the spells, starting with the field spell, which is Peggle. Up to thrice per turn, you can target one Peggle monster, treat it as a continuous trap in your spell and trap zone, special summon it, then draw one card. If a Peggle Pendulum monster is sent to the extra deck, you can send that monster to your spell and trap zone as a continuous trap. You can only special summon light monsters the turn you activate Peggle. You can only activate Peggle once per turn. And then we have the Extreme Fever spell card. This card is always treated as a Peggle card. Place up to 2 monsters in your deck or pendulum zone face up in your spell and trap zone as continuous traps, then draw one card. Then if you control a link monster, you can target up to 2 monsters that are treated as a continuous trap on the field, special summon them. You can only activate Extreme Fever once per turn. And then going into the final card, the Trap Peggle Trophy Room is a continuous trap. You can activate this card the turn it was set if you control a Peggle Link monster. If a Peggle card is added to your hand, quick effect, you can place one Peggle monster in your hand, face up extra deck or grave into your spell and trap zone as a continuous trap. You can only use effect of Peggle Trophy Room once per turn. So back up to the top. I'll start with some generic feedback just for the entire deck. So first of all, I think there's just too many easy pluses. I know that card generation effects are super abundant these days, but even so, I think there's just too many effects here that give you extra draws on top of already good effects. So that's one thing. The second thing is that the restriction that the main deck monsters have on not being able to summon specific level of monsters isn't really much of a restriction, since A, the monsters here all have different levels, and B, the restriction wouldn't apply to link summoning anyways. So I would recommend changing that restriction to you can only summon Peggle monsters for the rest of the turn, and that would apply to all of the main deck monsters. So moving into the specifics of the cards, Peggle Ball. So both of the points I just made will apply to this card, where that first effect gets you a search and a draw, and the second effect has a restriction on level 1s that probably doesn't really hurt the deck at all. So another thing I would say about this card is that it shouldn't be able to search another copy of itself, which is typically par for the course these days on searchers. They can't search themselves. This could just easily be abused by other pendulum decks, where it basically lets you bring out whatever in your pendulum zone, plus this card has an extra body, plus getting another copy of the ball on deck, and then that extra draw on top of everything else. So I think putting that restriction fixes that issue. Moving into Master Bjorn. So the pendulum effect is a better example of a balanced effect here, is where you have a legitimate cost that then feeds your engine. So I like that there. The in-hand effect, yeah, it just can't exist. Konami has very much hunkered down on draw 1 cards, which is basically what this is. You place it in your spell and trap zone as a continuous trap, and then draw 1 card. So I would require a specific condition to be able to activate that effect. The last effect here, I think, is fine, other than that mention about the level 5 restriction, which level 5, again, I don't think it's really hurting you all too much, since this is only level 5 in your deck. Moving into Claude. So same kind of energy with Bjorn. This is just too generic to, and going to be abused by other decks, where you place it in your pendulum zone, discard 1 card, then draw 2. I think for decks that really just benefits any deck, but then especially decks that really want to dig through their deck, like Exodia decks and whatnot, I think it's just too much. You need to have a more specific way to activate that effect, and honestly, I would just nix it all together. But definitely make it more archetype specific to be able to activate in the first place. On the spell search, same thing here. Nix that extra draw. Like, you don't need to add a draw on top of every other search effect. Like, search effects should be search effects, or if you want to have a draw effect, then just discard 1 card and draw 1 card. But again, that becomes a bit too generic. That could be abused by other archetypes. The summon effect here is fine. The restriction on level 4s, this is the one time where I think it actually is probably fine and meaningful, since level 4s would probably be in any sort of hybrid engine that you intend to run. But if you want to stay consistent among the resin, I would just slap it on here as well. That if you special summon, if you use that effect, then you can't special summon except Peggle monsters for the rest of the turn. Moving into the Renfield, I would say, yeah, like when I was reading it, change the word send to place. Otherwise, I think the effect is good here, where again you have a good trade-off, and then in turn you get 2 of your Peggles as traps. The reveal, I think, should be a discard instead. But I'll leave that to you. The second effect, though, is very much in line with the feedback again, where up top it's just too easy to draw power. So I would definitely change that here, where you're already getting a search this time from your grave, so you don't need to add a draw on top of that. The Master Cat-Tut. So the pendulum effect, I think, is fine here. Similar feedback here on Mirrenfield, where except with this one, I'll be more adamant. The reveal to search is just too powerful. It needs to be a search on summon or on discard. It can't just be revealed to search. I think that's just too much. On the monster effect, so you have here, while this card is a continuous trap, and then you have in brackets quick effect. So since it's being treated as a trap, I don't think you need to specify quick effect, since anything that's a trap is just assumed to be operating on a spell speed 2 level, which is what a quick effect is, so you wouldn't need to specify that. This is the same thing is going to apply to your actual trap later on down when we get to that. Otherwise, I think it's a good effect here, as long as you change the restriction on level 6 monsters to just Peggle monsters. Going into the Link monsters, the Splork, I think this card is good. Clearly just a stepping stone into your ultimate play, but just well designed for that purpose. And then we get to Cinderbottom. Where do I begin? So if you know me, you probably know where I'm about to go here, and that is the crazy level of removal that this card is capable of. The first one is a quick effect that doesn't target and places in the spell and trap zone, and the second is also a quick effect that gets you a +1 on top of it. So at the very least, I would make the following changes to this card, where the first effect only activates on Link summon, and the second effect, instead of bouncing a continuous trap on the field to hand, sends it to the grave instead. This guy doesn't have any protection, so it's easy to get rid of him, but kind of like what I've been saying with the other archetypes, sometimes it's less about meta relevance and more about design best practices, and I think easy pluses in the form of the best forms of removal, that is, they're not sending them to the grave, they're not destroying them, they're not targeting, they're not even banishing them, it's to your spell and trap zone, or to a spell and trap, to your spell and trap zone, and then back to the deck. Those are the best forms of removal, and they don't target at that. So it's just the fact that it has 2 forms of removal on one card, even if it is a Link 3, I just think it's too much for a singular card. That and in all honesty, it's probably pretty easy to bring out anyways, even if it is a link 3. Moving into the field spell. So same thing here, nix the draw. The fact that you could activate an effect 3 times per turn that would get you a draw is just too much anyways. I also wonder if this effect is even necessary considering how many ways you have of summoning monsters that are continuous traps. It makes sense for the field spell to be able to do that, but you might also be able to just come up with a more worthwhile effect that isn't redundant to what the deck is already very capable of. The second effect I do like though, plays into the pendulum mechanics and it helps to work in your favor, so that's good. The moving into extreme fever, so no, this is again too much. At its best, it's a draw and summoning 2 monsters from your deck. At the very least, I would again nix the draw and then specify that it has to be Peggle monsters. And if you want to keep the second half of the effect, then I would limit it to just 1 Peggle monster. So, and then PSCT thing here, you don't need the colon here. You would just say place up to 2 monsters in your deck or pendulum zone face up in your spell and trap zone as continuous traps, draw 1 card. Then if you control a link monster, you can target up to 2 monsters that are treated as continuous traps on the field, special summon them to your field. So I guess we need to go back here. Once the effect starts, you don't have any more colons or semicolons, so you wouldn't have any targeting, you wouldn't have any activation conditions, anything like that. So this would all just read as 1 effect, and then you wouldn't even say, you would just say, then if you control a link monster, you can special summon 2 monsters that are treated as continuous traps to your field. So that's all you'd have to work with. Yes. And then finally your trap. So again, quick effect doesn't need to say that. Since it's a trap is assumed to be spell speed 2. Mechanically, I think this would work better if it simply said you can activate it from your hand if you control a Peggle Link monster. That way it's just a smooth activate instead of a set and activate. It's kind of clunky in that regard. Plus, you can activate it on your opponent's turn in that way. So there, I gave a little buff, since otherwise I've been stripping the archetype of all its power. The main effect, I think, is fine, and I think otherwise this card is pretty good to go. So, onto the grading. For the design, I give it a 4. I like the concept of the deck, though I think maybe there are a number of redundancies and not enough playing on the fact that these monsters are being treated as traps. And another thing about the design that card designers need to consider is how other decks and other cards could interact with these. So like I mentioned, a lot of the draw power here could definitely be abused by decks like Exodia and just draw power in general, like the one where you discard 1 card to draw 2. That's a thing that like most decks, if not all, could benefit from. So one bright spot I will say though is that given this is a pendulum based deck, you did a good job of not overloading the text boxes, so definitely kudos on that. Creativity, I give a 5. So monsters as traps aren't a novel concept, most notably Centurion, but you added a nice spin by having them transition between pendulum, trap, and monster, and it fits neatly with the lore, but I think some more variety in the effects should help really stand out. And then for balance, I give a 3. I think there were a few examples of where you got the balance down pat, but generally speaking, the deck generates just way too much advantage with no investment required, and the boss has 2 overpower removal effects. So that gives the deck an average score of 4. Thank you, Rosa, for your submission.